She didn't know that night would change everything. A man walks into the diner at 11:47 p.m., black suit, soaked at the shoulders, eyes like a man who hasn't slept in years. Pittsburgh's worst storm in a decade is tearing itself apart outside, and Serena Vale is mopping the same stretch of floor she's mopped 10,000 times before. She doesn't look up when the bell above the door chimes. She should have. Because the man who just stepped out of the rain isn't lost. He isn't hungry. He's been searching for her for 15 years, and he just found what he was looking for. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and follow all the way to the end. Let's see how far this story travels. Ok. The mop hit the bucket with a hollow clang that echoed through the nearly empty diner, and Serena Vale straightened up with the particular kind of slowness that belongs to people who've been tired for so long, they've stopped noticing it. 28 years old, and her lower back already talked to her like an old enemy. She pressed one fist against the base of her spine and exhaled through her nose, scanning the room with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd worked closing shift long enough to do it in her sleep. 3 tables still occupied. Booth 4. A couple, mid-50s, splitting a slice of cherry pie they'd been nursing for 40 minutes. Counter stool 7. A trucker named Dell, who came in every Thursday with the same order and the same silence, which Serena respected more than most people's conversation. Table 9. 2 college girls sharing a basket of fries and a phone screen, laughing at something in the small private world of their earbuds. Outside, Pittsburgh was coming apart. The storm had started around 9, the kind of October rain that didn't fall so much as a tack, horizontal sheets of it slapping the plate glass windows, gutters running black with leaves, the neon sign for Polly's Family Diner bleeding pink and yellow light across the flooding sidewalk. The bell above the door had barely rung all evening. Serena had swept twice, restocked the sugar caddies, and refolded the napkin stack at the service counter so many times it was starting to feel compulsive. She was 22 minutes from freedom. "You heading straight home after?" called Marcus from behind the pass-through window. He was the cook on Thursday nights, a big man with flour on his forearms and a habit of asking questions he already knew the answers to. "Same as always," Serena said. "Your mom doing okay?" She rinsed the mop head without looking up. "Same as always." Marcus didn't push. He'd known her long enough to read the geography of her answers. The shorter they got, the less ground there was to cover. Serena Vale had been working at Polly's for 4 years, 3 months, and somewhere around 11 days, though she'd stopped counting the exact number sometime last spring when she decided that counting was a form of grief she couldn't afford. She'd taken the job at 24 after her mother's second hospitalization, when the medical bills started arriving in envelopes so thick they felt like threats. She'd told herself it was temporary, a bridge between where she was and where she was still going. She'd believed that for about a year before the bridge became the destination. Her mother, Caroline Vale, was 53 years old and had been fighting a progressive autoimmune condition for the past 6 years. The kind of illness that didn't kill you quickly, but instead disassembled you by degrees, taking function and independence in small, deliberate pieces, while the medical system sent you invoices for the privilege of losing them. Serena was her only child, her only support. And so the interior design degree that Serena had been 2 semesters away from completing when her mother first got sick sat in a folder in the bottom drawer of her dresser, like evidence of a crime she didn't commit. She didn't talk about it much. She'd learned that talking about sacrifice made people either pity you or praise you, and she didn't want either. Pity felt like a diagnosis. Praise felt like permission to stop. At 11:43 p.m., the couple in booth 4 left a $5 tip and 2 forks crossed on an empty plate. Dell dropped a 10 on the counter without a word, pulled on his jacket, and pushed out into the rain with the deliberate movements of a man who'd accepted weather as just another obstacle between here and there. The college girls were still giggling at their phones. Serena started wiping down the counter. At 11:47, the bell above the door rang. She didn't look up immediately. She was working a stubborn coffee ring near the register, and her first thought was annoyance. 20 minutes to close, and whoever this was had just reset the clock. She'd have to take an order, run the food or drink, wait for them to finish, then close out the register all over again while Marcus grumbled in the kitchen. "I'll be right with you," she said, her voice carrying the precise warmth of someone who meant it professionally but not personally. No answer. She looked up. The man was standing just inside the door. He hadn't moved toward a table or a stool. He was just standing there, rain still dripping from the shoulders of a jacket that probably cost more than Serena's monthly rent, water darkening the black wool in irregular patches across his chest. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of physical presence that came not from size alone, but from something in the way he occupied space, like the room had quietly reorganized itself around him without asking anyone's permission. His face was, she would struggle later to describe it accurately, because the problem wasn't that it was remarkable, exactly, but that it was familiar in a way that made no immediate logical sense. Angular jaw, dark eyes under heavier brows, a scar, thin as a thread, bisecting the left corner of his lower lip. Maybe 35, maybe older, the kind of age that lived in someone's eyes before it reached their face. He was looking at her, not in the way men sometimes looked at her, which she'd learned to register and dismiss with the efficiency of a smoke alarm recognizing a false trigger. This was different. This was the look of someone doing the specific cognitive work of recognition, searching her face with the focused intensity of a person cross-referencing memory against reality, checking one against the other. "Sit anywhere," she said. He sat at the counter. Third stool from the left, one removed from where Dell had been. He set his jacket on the stool beside him, not to claim space, but because he'd barely seemed to notice doing it, and laced his hands together on the counter with a careful, deliberate stillness. Serena pulled out her order pad from habit. "Coffee? Black," he said. His voice was low and controlled, the kind of voice that had learned somewhere along the way not to give anything away. Pittsburgh accent, though flattened and worn smooth, like someone who'd spent years moving through rooms where local origins were liabilities. She poured the coffee, set it in front of him, and clicked her pen. "Kitchen closes in 15. We've got the lentil soup," he said, "and whatever bread you've got left." She wrote it down. Went to the pass-through and called it in to Marcus, who responded with a grunt she'd learned to interpret as fine, but I'm noting this. She pulled out 2 bread rolls from the basket under the heat lamp and wrapped them in a cloth napkin and brought them back. The man hadn't touched his coffee. He was watching her. "Something else?" she said. "No." A pause. "Thank you." She went back to wiping down the counter at the far end, giving him the professional distance that was the only courtesy she had left to offer this late in a shift. The 2 college girls finally packed up and left in a gust of cold air and laughter. Marcus shut down the grill with a hiss of steam. The diner went quiet except for the rain and the low murmur of the heating system. Serena kept cleaning, but she was aware of him in the way you become aware of a sound you can't immediately identify. Not threatening, not ignorable, just present in a way that wouldn't let itself be filed away. When she brought the soup, he'd finally picked up the coffee cup. He was staring into it the way people stare at fires, not seeing it, seeing something else. "Rough night?" she said, because the silence had a weight to it that felt like it needed a door opened. He looked up at her. Those dark eyes, direct and unguarded for just a second before the control came back down. "Long week," he said. "The soup helps," she said. "Old recipe. Polly's grandmother, allegedly." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something smaller and more careful than that. Allegedly. Nobody's verified it, but it sounds better than bag we got from a restaurant supply warehouse. He picked up the spoon. "Does it matter where it came from if it works?" She looked at him for a moment. "Depends what you mean by works." He didn't answer that. He ate the soup slowly, methodically, like a man who'd forgotten several meals and was trying not to make a scene of the hunger. He broke one of the bread rolls into pieces rather than biting directly into it, and she noticed, in the detached, observational way she'd developed from years of reading tables, that his hands were not the hands of someone who'd spent his life in offices. The knuckles were wrong. There was an old scar across the back of his right hand that had healed imperfectly, pulling the skin slightly in a way that suggested it had been closed under less than ideal conditions. She went back to her closing tasks. At 12:08, Marcus leaned through the pass-through. "I'm out. Lock up?" "Yeah," she said. "Go." The back door shut. The kitchen went dark. Now it was just Serena and the man at the counter and the rain working itself into a frenzy against the windows. She poured herself a coffee, a thing she almost never did this late, but something about tonight felt like it required fuel, and stood behind the counter with her hands wrapped around the mug. "Last call," she said. The man looked up from the empty bowl. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew his wallet, black leather, worn at the corners, and set a folded bill on the counter without looking to see what it was. Then he reached into a different pocket and brought out a business card. He set both items on the counter and pushed them toward her. She picked up the bill first, as was professional habit, and her stomach did a quiet, involuntary thing when she saw the denomination. She looked at him. That's too much. It's not, he said. She opened her mouth to argue. The soup was worth it, he said. The conversation was worth it. He paused. You were worth it. Something in his voice when he said that. Not lecherous, not performative, just flat and certain, like a man stating a fact he'd verified independently, made her close her mouth. She picked up the card. It was plain, heavy stock. One side had a phone number, no name, no company. On the other side, 4 words had been written by hand in black ink, in the careful script of someone who didn't write by hand often, but wanted this particular thing to be legible. I finally found you. The silence in the diner stretched. Serena looked at the card, then at the man, then at the card again. I think you've got the wrong person, she said. I don't. He stood, picking up his jacket from the neighboring stool. He was looking at her with that same focused quality, that same look of someone checking memory against reality and finding the check confirmed. Your name is Serena. You grew up in Collier Township before the family moved. You had a house, small, near the water. There was a creek behind it. You used to build things in the mud on the bank, little structures, walls and roofs. You called them something. Frog houses, I think. The coffee mug in Serena's hands went very still. She hadn't thought about frog houses in 20 years. There was a summer, the man continued, his voice quiet and even, when a kid from the neighborhood used to come down to that creek. He was older, maybe 9 or 10 to your 7 or 8. He had a black eye, and he wasn't talking much. You didn't ask him about it. You just handed him a piece of clay and told him to build something. The heating system hummed. Rain hit the glass. Serena's heartbeat had done something irregular and was trying to find its way back to normal. I don't, she started. You don't remember me, he said. That's okay. He pulled on his jacket. I remember you. He walked to the door, pushed it open against the rain and the wind without hesitation. The number on the card is mine, he said. You don't have to call it, but I'd like it if you did. And then he was gone. The door swung shut. Serena stood behind the counter of the empty diner for a long moment, the business card held between 2 fingers like a thing she hadn't yet decided was safe to put down, the 4 handwritten words facing her. She turned the card over, looked at the phone number, turned it back. Frog houses. She'd been 7 years old. The creek behind their old house in Collier Township had been shallow and cold, running brown over smooth stones, and she'd spent entire summer afternoons building small, enclosed structures on the muddy bank, roofed with sticks, walled with packed clay, because she'd read somewhere that frogs liked houses, and she'd wanted to make sure they had good ones. She hadn't thought about it in 2 decades. It wasn't a memory she'd ever told anyone. It was just a piece of childhood so small and specific it had no reason to exist anywhere except inside her own head. And this man, this stranger in an expensive jacket with a scar on his lip and someone else's old money in his posture, had just handed it back to her. She set the business card on the counter, picked up her phone, put it back down, picked up the business card again and stared at the number. Then she tucked it into the front pocket of her apron, turned off the lights in the dining room one by one, and finished locking up the diner while the storm outside reached something close to a crescendo, rain falling so hard it turned the world beyond the glass into pure abstract sound. She stood under the diner's small awning for a moment, her bag on her shoulder, the cold October air cutting through her uniform. The street was empty and gleaming. A black car sat parked across the street, long, dark, engine off. And she noticed it the way you notice something that's been there long enough to become part of the scenery, but suddenly, at the right angle, becomes specifically visible. She took the bus home. In the apartment on Meredith Street, the lights in the second bedroom were still on. Serena hung up her jacket, washed her hands at the kitchen sink, and pushed open the bedroom door quietly. Her mother was awake, propped against pillows, the television on low, a nature documentary, elephants moving through dry grass. Late, Caroline said. Had a customer right at close. Serena dropped onto the edge of the bed and started pulling off her work shoes. You eat? Mrs. Dalton brought soup around 6. Good soup? Acceptable soup. Caroline studied her daughter with the particular attention of a woman who'd been reading Serena's face since birth. You look strange. I look tired. You always look tired. Tonight you look strange and tired. What happened? Serena pulled the business card from her apron pocket and looked at it again for a moment. Then she folded it and tucked it into the pocket of her jeans. Nothing, she said. Weird customer. Caroline held her gaze a beat longer than comfortable, then let it go. The documentary is good, she said. Elephants. I see that. Serena stood, pressed a kiss to the top of her mother's head. Sleep. I'll check on you before I go to bed. She went to her own room, sat on the edge of her bed, and took the card out of her jeans, turned it over, read both sides again. She was not a woman who allowed herself romantic frameworks. Romantic frameworks required a surplus of hope, and hope was something Serena had learned to ration carefully, not because she'd stopped believing in it entirely, but because she'd discovered that hope was the most expensive thing a person could carry, and she was already over her weight limit. She paid for her mother's medications and her mother's specialist appointments and the physical therapy sessions that the insurance covered only partially and the supplemental vitamins that the insurance didn't cover at all. She worked 40 hours a week at a diner and picked up occasional weekend shifts at a catering company when the money got tight enough that she could feel it in her chest. She did not have the budget for mystery men with handwritten messages and inexplicable knowledge of childhood memories. She did not have the budget for whatever feeling was currently making itself at home in the region between her sternum and her throat. She put the card in her nightstand drawer, lay back on her bed, still in her uniform, and stared at the water stain on the ceiling that she'd been meaning to report to the landlord since March. The man's voice. You used to build things in the mud on the bank. Little structures, walls and roofs. You called them something, frog houses, I think? She closed her eyes. The creek. The mud. The cold water running over her bare feet. The sound of someone sitting down on the bank behind her, and the instinct she'd had at 7 years old not to ask why someone was crying, just to hand them a piece of clay and let them do something with their hands. Because that's what she always did when she didn't know what to say. She built things. She opened her eyes. The water stain. She reached over and turned off the lamp, lay in the dark, and listened to the rain outside and the television murmur from her mother's room, and somewhere in the building above her, someone's kid making a noise that could have been laughter, or crying, she couldn't tell which. She slept. And in the morning, she opened the nightstand drawer and looked at the card again before she was fully awake, before the rational part of her brain had come fully online to talk her out of it. She didn't call, but she didn't throw it away. Damien Moretti was 36 years old and had been afraid of nothing since he was 9, not because fear had stopped existing in his body, but because he'd spent the better part of 3 decades teaching himself to outpace it. He ran a criminal organization with interests across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and the eastern seaboard that moved money through a labyrinth of shell companies, legitimate businesses, and very carefully maintained political relationships. He had 16 people on his personal security detail. He had 3 properties in Pittsburgh alone, not counting the penthouse on Fifth Avenue that he used as a primary residence. He had people who were afraid of him across 2 time zones. He drove home from the diner that night and sat in the back seat of the car while his driver navigated the flooded streets without speaking, because his driver knew better, and Damien stared out the rain-blurred window at the city he'd spent 20 years building a cage around and thought about frog houses. He'd been 9 years old that summer. His father had been Emile Moretti, who was not a good man in any sense that could be usefully applied, and who communicated displeasure with his fists in the manner of someone who'd never been taught any other language. The black eye that summer had come from a disagreement about a broken window and had been accompanied by 2 cracked ribs that nobody had ever officially documented. Damien had walked to the creek because the creek was the only place in the neighborhood where the trees were thick enough that you couldn't see any of the houses, and for 30 minutes you could exist in a geography that had no fathers in it. The girl had been there, small, serious, dark hair pulled into 2 uneven braids, sitting on the mud bank with her knees up and her bare feet in the cold water, building something with clay and sticks and absolute concentration, as if the fate of a small but important civilization depended on her getting the walls right. She'd looked up at him once, taken in the black eye with the direct, unsentimental assessment of a child who hadn't yet learned to politely ignore visible damage, and then she'd looked back down at what she was building. A moment later, without looking up, she'd reached over and pushed a handful of clay toward him on the bank. He hadn't known what to do with it. He'd sat down and picked it up and turned it over in his hands. "You can make a wall," she'd said. "Mine keeps collapsing on that side." He'd made the wall. That summer, he'd gone back to that creek maybe a dozen times. They'd never exchanged full names. He'd never talked about his eye or his ribs or his father. She'd never asked. They just built things. Walls and floors and roofs, small enclosed spaces in the clay, because she'd explained with the absolute authority of a 7-year-old that frogs needed houses and it was important to make good ones. He'd moved that fall. His mother had taken him and disappeared into a different part of the city, away from Emile, and the creek and the girl and the frog houses had become a fragment of something he carried without quite knowing what it was. Not nostalgia exactly, because the rest of that summer held nothing worth nostalgic about. Just a small, clean memory, intact and undamaged, preserved somewhere below the layers of everything that came after. He'd thought about her sometimes over the years. Not obsessively, not romantically, when he was younger. Just occasionally, the way you sometimes think about evidence of an earlier version of yourself. Proof that there had been a person there before the person you became. He'd found her by accident, or something like accident. One of his associates had organized a charity event at a downtown venue 2 weeks ago, and Damien had walked through the catering entrance by mistake. And there had been a woman arranging glassware on a service table with the kind of focused, practiced efficiency that meant she was very good at a job she hadn't chosen. She'd looked up at him in that brief, professional, I'll be right with you way, and something in his brain had performed a violent, involuntary act of cross-referencing that he couldn't immediately explain. He'd had his security team pull her employee file from the catering company's system within 12 hours. Serena Vale. Age 28, Pittsburgh native. Mother on long-term disability. No active social media. Current employer. Polly's Family Diner, Greenfield neighborhood. He'd sat with that file for 3 days before going to the diner. I wasn't sure what he'd expected. Recognition, maybe. A confirmation of the intuition that kept insisting, without evidence, that the specifics of that long-ago creek bank were still somehow present in this woman's face. He'd told himself he only wanted to confirm. To check the memory against reality and put the thing to rest. What he had not expected was to sit at that counter and feel, for the first time in years, like he was somewhere that made sense. She'd served him soup. She'd made a joke about the recipe that was sharp and dry and stripped of performance. She'd given him exactly the amount of space he needed without being asked. And when she'd stood behind the counter with her coffee cup and the rain coming down outside, she'd had the look of someone who'd been carrying too much for too long without once considering putting it down. A look he recognized with the precision of a man who'd worn it himself for most of his adult life. He'd written the 4 words on the card in the car. He hadn't planned to write anything. He'd planned to leave a tip, confirm the identity, and go home to process what came next with the methodical deliberation he applied to every other significant decision. But he'd been sitting in the parking lot with the pen in his hand and the card on his knee, and he'd thought about the mud and the collapsed wall, and the serious little girl who hadn't asked him anything, just handed him clay, and he'd written, I finally found you. And then he'd gone back inside and given it to her. Now he was in his penthouse on Fifth Avenue, standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows in the living room, looking out over a city he owned significant pieces of, and he was thinking about a woman behind a diner counter who'd looked at his handwriting and said, I think you've got the wrong person, with a stillness that told him she wasn't entirely sure she was right. You're going to make this complicated, said a voice from the doorway. Damien didn't turn around. He knew the voice. Nico Reyes, his head of operations, who'd been with him for 9 years and had earned the right to say things most people couldn't. Go home, Nico. Rains called while you were out. Nico crossed the room with the measured pace of a man who'd learned to read Damien's silences and calibrate his approach accordingly. He stopped a few feet away and looked out the same window without being asked to. The Calloway situation needs a decision by Friday. Friday I'll give him a decision. He also wants the meeting moved up. No. Silence. Damien. Nico's voice dropped 1 register. Where were you tonight? Out. The tracker showed Greenfield. Damien finally turned from the window. He looked at Nico with the level, undemonstrative gaze that most people found more unsettling than anger. Did I ask you to check the tracker? Nico held the look for a moment, then looked away first. Not out of weakness, but out of long practice. The way a man steps back from an open flame, not because he's afraid of it, but because he knows exactly how hot it burns. No, he said. Then we're done with that conversation. I'm not going to pretend I don't know what's in Greenfield. Damien was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the rain was slowing, the storm burning itself out somewhere over the river. She doesn't know who I am, he said finally. She will. That's a problem for a different night. It's a problem for right now, Nico said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite concern, but was adjacent to it. The specific unease of a man whose entire professional existence depended on a single other man staying emotionally uncomplicated. You know what happens when the people around you become visible? You made the rules yourself. Damien said nothing. She's a waitress in Greenfield, Nico said. She has nothing, no protection, no resources, no understanding of... I know what she has, Damien said. The flatness in his voice was a wall going up, and Nico was too experienced not to recognize the architecture. I know exactly what she has and what she doesn't. I don't need you to inventory it for me. Nico looked at him for a long moment. The Callaway meeting, he said finally. Friday. Friday, Damien confirmed. Nico left. Damien turned back to the window. He stood there for a long time. The city spread below him in lights and rain-slick streets, the river running black and fast under the bridges, the whole machinery of the life he'd built ticking quietly in every direction. He thought about a woman standing under a diner awning in the rain, her bag over her shoulder, her face pointed into the wind with the look of someone who'd been pointing into the wind for a long time and had stopped expecting it to change. He thought about what she'd looked like when he'd described the creek, how the coffee mug had gone still in her hands, how for just a second, before the wall had come back up, something had moved across her face. Not fear, not confusion, but something older and more complicated, the specific expression of a person finding, without warning, that a door they'd forgotten existed still had a working lock. He reached into his jacket pocket and touched the edge of his phone. He didn't call her, but he stood at the window until almost 3 in the morning, which was, for Damien Moretti, something close to keeping vigil. 3 days passed. Serena didn't call the number. She took the Tuesday shift, the Wednesday double, the Thursday closing. She filled sugar caddies and ran credit cards and told the table of regulars in booth 6. The same joke she'd been telling them for 2 years about the pie and the weather, and they laughed in the same place they always did, and she refilled their coffee and moved on. She did not think about the card. She thought about the card constantly. She thought about it during the bus ride to her mother's Thursday appointment with the specialist, sitting with her coat pulled tight while the city scrolled by in gray November light. She thought about it while she sat in the waiting room with a magazine she didn't read, listening to the muffled conversation through the closed door, running the arithmetic of the copay they hadn't quite budgeted for. Frog houses, I think. No one could know that. There was no logical mechanism. She hadn't posted about it anywhere. She barely had social media, and what she did have was the kind of dormant, half-abandoned presence that was more absence than anything else. She hadn't mentioned it to anyone she currently knew. It was a piece of childhood so specific and so small that it lived only inside her own head, or so she'd believed. And yet, she pulled out the card and looked at it in the specialist's waiting room, heavy stock. Phone number on one side, 4 words on the other. She thought about the man's face. Not attractive, exactly, though that wasn't quite accurate either. It was more that his face wasn't arranged for the purpose of being attractive. It was arranged for the purpose of being functional, and there happened to be something compelling in the architecture of that. The scar on his lip, the careful stillness of someone who'd spent a long time learning not to broadcast, and the thing he'd looked like for just that fraction of a second before the control came back down, like a man who'd been walking toward something for a long time and had just arrived. She put the card away when the door opened and her mother's doctor came out to find her. Dr. Amara Osei was a compact woman in her 40s, with the brisk, efficient manner of someone who cared deeply, but had learned to communicate it in compressed form. She shook Serena's hand and they sat together in the small consultation room while Caroline rested in the exam room next door. The inflammation markers are up slightly from last month, Dr. Osei said. Not dramatically, but I want to adjust the dosage on the hydroxychloroquine and add a secondary anti-inflammatory. Serena had a notebook. She wrote it down. The physical therapy has been beneficial, Dr. Osei continued. I'd like to increase the frequency to twice weekly if we can manage it. What's the out-of-pocket on twice weekly? The doctor pulled up something on her tablet, gave her a number. Serena wrote that down too. Is there a generic available for the adjustment? I'll check. There may be. Serena nodded. kept her face doing what she needed it to do. After the appointment, she and her mother rode the bus home in the familiar, comfortable silence they'd developed over years of necessary economies. The kind of silence that wasn't empty but full of everything that didn't need to be said, because both of them already knew it. Caroline sat with her hands in her lap and watched the city go by. Serena ran numbers in her head and thought about picking up the extra Saturday shift at the catering company. "You still have that card," her mother said, without looking away from the window. Serena looked at her. "What?" "You keep reaching toward your pocket and stopping." Caroline turned to look at her daughter with the clear, unguarded assessment that had always been her particular gift. "The card from the strange customer." "I'm not reaching toward my pocket." "You are. You've been doing it for 3 days." Serena exhaled through her nose. "It's nothing." "Then throw it away." "I might." "You won't." Caroline turned back to the window. A pause. "What did it say?" Serena looked at the gray moving street for a long moment. "It said he found me," she said. Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Is that a threat?" she asked with the practical directness of a woman who'd lived long enough to know that "found me" could mean any number of things. "I don't think so," Serena said. "I don't know what it is." "Did you ask him?" "He left before I could." Another silence. The bus lurched around a corner. "He knew something about me," Serena said, and her voice had done something against her will, gone slightly quieter, slightly more careful, the tone she used when she was approaching something she didn't fully understand. "Something from when I was a kid. Something nobody could know." Caroline looked at her. "Frog houses," Serena said. The word dropped between them and her mother went very still. And then, carefully, slowly, Caroline Vale turned her head away again and looked back out the window at the city going by. And she was quiet for a long time, and the silence had a quality to it now that it hadn't had before. Denser somehow, textured in a way Serena couldn't immediately read. "Mom." "Finish your shift tonight," Caroline said. "Then come home." "That's not an answer." "No," her mother said. "It isn't." And she didn't say another word about it for the rest of the ride home. The charity gala was on a Friday. Serena had picked up the catering shift 2 weeks prior, before the diner encounter, before the card, before any of this. $45 an hour, dress code formal black, 8 to midnight at the Alcott Ballroom downtown. One of those events where the city's money gathered itself into the same room under the pretense of generosity so that everyone could verify that everyone else still had the right amount of it. She stood in the service corridor at 8:15 with a tray of champagne flutes and her hair pinned up and her feet already beginning their quiet protest, and she thought, as she had approximately 60 times in the past 4 days, throw the card away. She pushed through the door into the ballroom. The room was everything a room like that is designed to be. Enormous and gilded and crowded with people in expensive clothes performing the specific social athleticism of wealth at ease with itself. Crystal chandeliers. A string quartet doing something inoffensive in the corner. Tables with centerpieces that probably cost more than Serena's monthly rent arranged around a dance floor that was currently not being used but would be later, when enough champagne had circulated. She moved through the room with the particular near invisibility of service staff, present enough to be found when needed, absent enough to avoid disrupting the event's social logic. She'd developed this skill over years without naming it. You learn to exist in the margins of other people's significance. She was halfway across the room, tray balanced, navigating between a cluster of suits near the bar, when she felt someone's attention on her like a change in air pressure. She turned her head. He was standing 30 feet away. Black suit tonight. Not the wet, rain-darkened jacket from the diner, but something impeccably structured, the kind of clothing that didn't just fit but belonged. He was talking to a man in his 50s, or had been, but he'd stopped talking, and he was looking at her with the same focused quality she remembered, that cross-referencing look, except now it was warmer, or at least different. The searching was finished, she realized. He'd already confirmed. He wasn't checking anymore. I was just looking. Her tray stayed level by muscle memory alone. 2 people she was serving said thank you and took glasses. She nodded. She was entirely on autopilot. He excused himself from the conversation he'd been in. She could tell by the slight shift of the man beside him, the subtle reconfiguration of attention. And he crossed the room. He moved through the crowd with the efficiency of a man accustomed to rooms reorganizing themselves around him, which they did, she noticed. People stepped back slightly without appearing to, creating passage without acknowledging they were doing it. He stopped in front of her. "You didn't call," he said. "I don't call numbers I don't know," she said. "Fair." She looked at him steadily. Around them, the ballroom continued its orchestra of wealth and social performance. Entirely indifferent to the two of them standing in it, having a conversation that existed at a completely different frequency. "You know," she said, "a normal person, when they want to see someone again, leaves their name." "Damien," he said. "Damien Moretti." She knew the name. She knew the name the way everyone in Pittsburgh who paid attention to the city beneath the city's surface knew the name. Not from headlines, because Damien Moretti was careful enough to stay mostly out of them, but from the lower frequency, the whisper layer of the city, the conversations in diners and corner bars about who owned what and why certain things worked the way they worked and who you didn't cross. She kept her face doing what it needed to do. "I know who you are," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I know you do," he said. "I came anyway." A beat. "There was a summer," he said, his voice dropping, not out of drama but out of precision, the way you lower your voice when what you're saying has weight. "Collier Township. You were 7, I was 9, and I had a black eye, and I didn't want to talk, and you didn't ask me to. You gave me clay." The tray in her hands was very steady. Inside her chest, something was happening that she didn't have an immediate word for. "We built a wall," he said, "for the Frog House, the south side that kept collapsing." The string quartet played something distant and irrelevant. "You remember the south side," she said. "I remember everything about that creek," he said simply. "I've been remembering it for 27 years. The ballroom noise rose and fell around them. Someone laughed loudly near the bar. Ice shifted in a bucket. "Why?" she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment the controlled surface of him did the thing she'd seen it do once before, went very slightly transparent, let something through that wasn't calculation or strategy. "Because it was the only place I'd ever felt like a person," he said. "And you were the one who did that, without knowing it, without asking for anything in return." She held his gaze for 5 full seconds. Then she said, "I have to finish my shift." "I know," he said, "and you have to go back to whoever you were talking to." "I do," he said, "but I want to see you again." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'll be at the diner," she said. "Tuesday through Thursday, closing shift." She walked back into the crowd, and she did not let herself look back, though she felt his gaze on her shoulder blades until she pushed through the door into the service corridor and stood in the fluorescent quiet with her tray and her heartbeat doing something undignified and complicated. She stood there for 30 seconds. Then she squared her shoulders and went back to work. But in the pocket of her black uniform jacket, the business card was warm from being held. And for the first time in a very long time, Serena Vale caught herself doing the one thing she'd sworn off years ago. She was hoping. He came in on Tuesday. 9:47 p.m. Rain again, but lighter this time, more suggestion than assault. He sat at the same stool, third from the left, and ordered black coffee, and the soup again, and she served him with the professional exactness she'd spent 4 years perfecting, and they talked, not about his name or what it meant, not about the empire she knew was attached to it. They talked about the city, about a building on Penn Avenue whose facade was being stripped for renovation, and what she thought they should do with the bones of it, about the particular quality of Pittsburgh light in October, which was different from any other city's October light, browner and more resigned. He asked questions and listened to the answers with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely interested in what she thought, and she found, to her carefully managed alarm, that she was genuine in return. When she cleared his bowl, he said, "You studied design." She looked at him. "The way you talked about the building," he said, "Penn Avenue." She was quiet for a moment. 2 years. A long time ago." "What happened?" "Life," she said. He didn't push. He nodded once, and she recognized in that nod the acknowledgement of someone who understood the weight of that answer and wasn't going to disrespect it by asking for more. He left a tip, and no card this time. He came back Thursday, and the Thursday after that. By the 3rd week, Serena Vale was lying in her bed at night and staring at the water stain and having the specific internal argument of a person in the early stages of something they recognize as dangerous and cannot yet make themselves walk away from. She was not naive. She knew what Damien Moretti was. She knew the architecture of the name and what it was built on. She knew that women who let men like that into their lives, even the margins of their lives, even just as a regular customer who came in twice a week and talked about the city and tipped generously, ended up with the specific kind of damage that didn't photograph well. She knew this, and she went to work on Tuesday anyway, and on Thursday, and she told herself it was just coffee, just conversation, just a man who remembered a creek. Until the Tuesday he walked in at 9:47 and sat at his stool and waited until the diner had emptied and Marcus had gone home. And then he looked at her across the counter and said, "I want to take you somewhere, not a date, I'm not asking for anything. I just want to show you something. Saturday morning, if you're free." She looked at him for a long time. "What is it?" she said. "A building," he said, "on Penn Avenue." She should have said no. She opened her mouth to say no. "What time?" she said instead. And outside the diner windows, the rain came down again, and somewhere in the city, in a penthouse on Fifth Avenue, she didn't yet know that an entire organization was watching, that an entire apparatus of power and violence and carefully maintained territory was about to notice the small, newly lit thing happening between a diner waitress in Greenfield and the man who ran it all. She didn't know any of that yet. All she knew was that she said Saturday, and that somewhere deep in the part of herself she'd kept locked up for years, the part that used to build walls out of clay on a creek bank and believe, with the absolute authority of a child, that frogs needed houses and it mattered to make them good. Something had just said yes before she could stop it. The building on Penn Avenue had been empty for 11 years. Serena knew this the way she knew most things about Pittsburgh's built environment. Not from research, but from accumulated observation, the kind of knowledge you absorb through years of moving through a city at street level rather than above it. She'd passed it on the bus dozens of times. 5 stories of pre-war brick with arched window frames and a cornice line that someone had put real thought into once, back when people still believed that buildings owed the street something beyond square footage. The facade had been stripped to raw brick on the lower 2 floors by whoever had started the renovation project, and then stopped, leaving the building in a state of interrupted becoming, half-dressed, caught between what it had been and what someone had briefly intended it to be. Damien was already there when she arrived at 8 Saturday morning, standing on the sidewalk in front of it, with his hands in the pockets of a dark jacket, no driver visible, no security she could immediately identify. He looked different in daylight, less architectural, more human. There were shadows under his eyes that the diner's overhead light had smoothed out. "You came," he said. "I said I would," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was starting to recognize, something that lived just under the controlled surface of him, something that hadn't fully learned to hide yet, or had decided not to. Then he pulled a key from his pocket. "You own this building," she said. It wasn't a question. "I own the LLC that owns this building," he said, "which is the same thing, more or less." "Why is it empty?" "Because the last 2 architects I hired told me what they thought I wanted to hear, instead of what the building needed." He put the key in the lock. "I'm hoping you'll tell me what it actually needs." "I'm not an architect." "I know what you are," he said. He pushed the door open. "That's why I'm asking." Inside, the building smelled of old plaster and cold stone, and the particular mineral damp of a space that had been closed up and breathed on by no one for too long. Serena stepped in and stood still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, letting her other senses do the preliminary work they always did before she looked with intention. High ceilings. Original hardwood floors, under a layer of construction dust, boards still sound from the looks of it. The bones of a grand staircase on the right, balustrade gone, but the structural elements intact. Light falling in long rectangles from the tall east-facing windows, picking out the dust motes and the ghost of what the room had been. She walked to the center of the main floor, turned slowly. Damien stood near the door and watched her without speaking. He had the quality she'd noticed at the diner, of knowing when to be still. Most people filled silence with themselves. He didn't. "What did the architects tell you?" she said, without turning around. "First one wanted to gut it. Open plan, glass partitions, make it look like a tech office." "No." "Second one wanted to restore it to original spec. Period accurate everything." She turned to look at him. "Also no." "Why not?" "Because authentic restoration of a building like this turns it into a museum exhibit. It stops being a living space and starts being a performance of a living space." She looked back up at the cornice detail. "This building wants to be used. It wants to be inhabited, not preserved. He was quiet. The bones are good, she said. The staircase can come back. Those window frames, the arches, you keep those and you build everything else around them, not the other way around. She moved toward the staircase, tested the bottom step with her weight. It held. What's the intended use? Mixed. Ground floor commercial. I was thinking a restaurant or a market. Upper floors residential. How many units on each floor? That's what I can't decide. Architects keep trying to maximize the unit count, and every time they do, they kill the proportions. She climbed halfway up the staircase and looked down at the main floor from that angle. The light was doing something specific from up here, coming through the east windows at a low angle and painting the floor in stripes of gold and shadow, the dust hanging in it like suspension. 2 units per floor, she said. Large ones. You'll leave money on the table per square foot, but you'll have something people actually want to live in instead of something they're willing to tolerate. Damien looked up at her from the ground floor. How do you know that? He said. Because I've been tolerating my apartment for 4 years, she said, and I know exactly what it's costing me to do that, and it's not money. A silence opened up in the building around them, big and echoey, and not uncomfortable. She came back down the stairs. They spent another hour in the building. She moved through it room by room on each floor, and he followed, and she talked, and he listened. Not in the deferential, agreeable way of someone performing interest. In the way of someone taking notes, filing things away, pushing back occasionally with a question that told her he'd been thinking about the same problem from a different angle. On the 3rd floor, standing in the room with the best light, she said, "You're not going to use what those architects told you." "No," he said. "Are you going to use what I'm telling you?" He looked at her. "Yes." "I'm not a licensed professional." "I know. What I'm saying is opinion, informed opinion, but Serena." His voice was quiet and even. "I didn't bring you here to get a permit-ready schematic. I brought you here because you see the building. The other people I hired looked at square footage and liability. You walked in, and the first thing you did was stand still." She looked at him for a moment. "That's not a credential," she said. "It's the only one I care about," he said. She turned back to the window. The city below. Penn Avenue in the gray-gold morning light, the sidewalk wet from overnight rain, a coffee cart on the corner, a man walking a dog with the resigned patience of a person doing the thing that needed doing on a cold morning. Her city. The one she'd been moving through at street level for 28 years. "I'll draw something up," she said. "Not formal drawings, just a rough concept. Ideas." "I'd like that," he said. She nodded, looked at the window. Her reflection in the glass, her face, the room behind her, and Damien standing maybe 6 feet back, his hands in his pockets, watching her with an expression that she'd categorized before as unreadable, but was starting to revise that assessment. It wasn't unreadable. It was just very careful. It was the face of a man who'd learned to hold things gently because he'd broken them before by holding too hard. She recognized that. She recognized it the way you recognize a language you haven't spoken in years, not fluently, but in the bones. She didn't say any of that. "Coffee," she said. "There's a place 2 blocks over." "I know it," he said. "Of course you do," she said, and she started for the stairs, and she heard him behind her, and she didn't let herself examine too closely the fact that she was walking toward coffee with Damien Moretti on a Saturday morning in a building full of good bones, and she was not, for the first time in a very long time, thinking about the copay. Nico Reyes found out about the Saturday meeting, the same way he found out about most things, through a combination of the tracker on Damien's car and a contact at the LLC who owed him a professional courtesy. He sat in his own office, a room on the 4th floor of a building in Shadyside that officially belonged to a property management company, and looked at the information on his phone and felt a cold, specific dread that he recognized from the handful of other times in 9 years he'd felt it. The dread of a man watching the careful architecture of a well-maintained situation develop a crack in the foundation. He called Vincent Palazzo at 9:30 Saturday morning. Vincent was 54 years old and had been Damien Moretti's consigliere since before Damien had taken over the organization from his predecessor, a function that, in practical terms, meant that Vincent had more institutional knowledge of the Moretti operation than anyone alive, and had survived 3 different leadership transitions by being the person who remembered where everything was kept. He was not a warm man. He was a precise one. "I know," Vincent said, when Nico had said maybe a sentence and a half. How long have you known? Long enough. The sound of a coffee cup being set down. How serious is it? Serious enough that he spent Saturday morning walking a building with her. A pause. The Penn Avenue property, Vincent said. Yes. Another pause. He's wanted someone to look at that building for 2 years. The architects have been useless. I'm not talking about the building. I know you're not. Vincent's voice was the same temperature it always was. Winter flat, particular. Has he said anything to you directly? He told me to stop checking the tracker. Which means he knows you're watching. He's always known I'm watching. That's never stopped him from communicating. Nico pushed back from his desk and stood, moving to the window out of habit. He's not communicating, that's the problem. A long silence on the line. Who is she? Vincent asked. Her name is Serena Vale. She's a waitress. 28. Mother sick, long-term disability. No assets, no connections, no awareness of who he actually is. She knows the name. Knowing the name and knowing what the name means are different things. How different? Different enough, Nico said. She's not positioning. She's not playing anything. As far as I can tell, she's just a person. He heard how that sounded and pressed on. Which is the problem. If she were positioning, we'd know how to handle it. She's not. Which means if this continues, she's going to get hit with the full reality of what he is, and there's no telling. Nico. Vincent's voice cut clean across the line. What do you want me to do? I want you to talk to him. He doesn't take guidance on personal matters. He's never had personal matters. That's the issue. He's built the whole architecture of this organization on the premise that he doesn't have exposure points. If she becomes an exposure point, she already is, Vincent said. The moment he walked into that diner, she was. The cold dread settled deeper. Talk to him, Nico said. I'll consider it, Vincent said, which was the closest Vincent ever came to yes, and hung up. The coffee shop. 2 blocks from the Penn Avenue building was small and warm and smelled of roasted beans and old wood, the kind of place that had been there long enough to have a settled identity that didn't need to perform itself. They sat across a small table near the front window with paper cups and the specific, slightly compressed quality of 2 people who've been having one kind of conversation all morning and are now recalibrating. Serena wrapped her hands around her cup. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes, he said. The black eye. She looked at him directly. That summer. Where did it come from? He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, she'd learned to read the difference between his silences by now, the small taxonomy of them. This one was the silence of someone deciding how much precision to apply. My father, he said. Was that regular? Yes. She nodded once, looked at her coffee. Is he still alive? No. Did you? She stopped. No, he said. He managed that himself. Heart attack, when I was 22. A beat. I didn't go to the funeral. Okay, she said. That was all. She didn't soften it, didn't offer the performative sympathy that the statement usually collected from people who hadn't earned the right to give it. He looked at her across the table with an expression she couldn't completely read. You do that thing, he said. What thing? You don't ask for more than what's been offered. When you were 7, when you were... He stopped. You've always done that. I learned it from somewhere, she said. People deserve to give what they want to give, not what you think you need. Most people disagree with that. Most people are anxious, she said. Anxiety makes you extractive. He looked at her for a long moment. What are you afraid of? He said. The directness of it landed cleanly, without warning, and she felt it in her chest before her brain caught up. She looked at her coffee cup. Hope, she said. And then, before he could respond, I'm afraid of hoping for things. I've gotten very efficient at not doing it. It took a long time to get efficient at it, and I'm not interested in dismantling the system. That's not living, he said. That's maintenance. Maintenance keeps people alive, she said. Living is a luxury. It doesn't have to be. She looked at him. You run a criminal organization, she said, flat and even. You have an empire built on... She stopped. Recalibrated. I'm not pretending I don't know what I know. I'm not asking you to. Then what are you asking for? He held her gaze. The coffee shop moved around them. A barista calling out an order, the door opening and closing on cold air, the muted city noise of Saturday morning. The ordinary world doing its ordinary things. One honest step forward, he said. Not a commitment, not a decision about what I am or what this is. Just don't walk away because it's complicated. She was quiet for a long time. Everything in my life is already complicated, she said finally. I know. I can't afford more complicated. I know that too. Then why are you here? She said, and it came out rawer than she intended, the edge of genuine frustration breaking through. Why are you sitting in this coffee shop with me on a Saturday morning telling me one honest step forward? You're Damian Moretti. You walk away from this table and you go back to a world that has nothing to do with diner shifts and specialist copays, and I don't want to walk away from this table, he said. The simplicity of it stopped her. He said it the way someone states a fact. They've already verified thoroughly. No performance in it. No escalation. Just a flat, certain statement from a man who'd spent 36 years being very careful about what he said out loud, and had apparently decided to stop being careful about this particular thing. She looked at him. I don't know what to do with you, she said. You don't have to do anything with me, he said. I'm just asking to be in the same room. She exhaled through her nose, the sound she made when she was losing an argument with herself. My mother has a follow-up appointment on Thursday, she said. The specialist is on Center Avenue. She takes the bus, but the 61C is unreliable after 3, and if she misses it, she has to wait 40 minutes in the cold, and her... She stopped. I'm telling you this because I'm not asking for anything. I'll have a car there at 2:30, he said. I'm not asking... I know, he said. Thursday, 2:30 Center Avenue. She looked at him for a long moment. She'll ask questions, Serena said. Mothers do, he said. The corner of her mouth did something involuntary. She pressed it back down. One step, she said. One step, he said. The car was there Thursday. A black sedan, a driver named Wallace, who was large and quiet and held the door open for Caroline Vale with the impeccable, non-performative courtesy of someone for whom the gesture was genuine rather than instructed. Caroline got in with the careful, deliberate movements of someone whose body required negotiation, and she looked at the interior of the car with the assessing gaze she applied to everything, and she didn't ask questions. Not on the way there. On the way back, as the sedan moved through the Thursday afternoon traffic on Center Avenue, Caroline looked out the window and said, How old is he? 36, Serena said. And what he does? You know what he does. Caroline was quiet. You know his name, Serena said. I saw your face when I told you about the creek. Her mother turned from the window. Her face was doing the thing it did when she was holding two positions at once, the careful, neutral surface and the weight of something underneath it. I knew his father, Caroline said. Emile Moretti. We grew up in the same neighborhood, long before you were born. The car moved through traffic. Emile was... Caroline's voice didn't change registers, but something in it went tight. He was a bad man. Specifically and deliberately bad. Not careless. Not... She stopped. Damien was his son. He's not his father, Serena said. No child ever is, Caroline said, and every child carries them anyway. She looked at her daughter. How does he look at you? Serena was quiet. Serena. Like I'm... She stopped, found the word. Like I'm something he doesn't want to lose. Caroline turned back to the window. Then be careful, she said. Not because of what he is, because of how that looks. And because in my experience, men who look at someone like that are capable of burning everything down when they believe it's in danger. The car moved on. The city outside went gray and gold, the particular palette of Pittsburgh in November. Bare branches and brick, and the river somewhere nearby, running cold and fast and brown. Serena sat with her hands in her lap and felt the territory around her shifting in the way terrain shifts before weather arrives. Not the storm itself yet, just the pressure change. The air doing something different, the quality of stillness that precedes upheaval. She thought about what her mother had said. Capable of burning everything down. She should have let that be a warning. Vincent Palazzo came to see Damien on a Tuesday evening. He didn't call ahead. He never called ahead, because calling ahead gave the other person time to construct a response, and Vincent had spent 30 years preferring to see the unstructured reaction. He walked into the Fifth Avenue penthouse at 6 p.m., bypassing security with the ease of a man who had his own code to the elevator, and he found Damien at the kitchen island with a laptop and a set of handwritten notes spread around him. A coffee gone cold at his elbow. Architectural sketches. Vincent looked at them. He recognized the handwriting in the margins. Not Damien's. A woman's hand, decisive and quick, annotating a rough floor plan with specificity and confidence. Damien looked up. "Vincent," he said. Not surprised. Not pleased either, exactly. "The Penn Avenue building," Vincent said, pulling out a stool and sitting with the unhurried ease of a man who intended to take his time. "I hear you found someone with ideas." "I have." Nico's concerned. Nico's always concerned, that's his function. His function is to identify risks. This qualifies. Damien closed the laptop. He looked at Vincent with the steady, measuring look he used when he knew a conversation was going to require him to hold a line. "You came here to tell me to stop seeing her. I came here to make sure you understand what continues to happen if you don't." Vincent folded his hands on the counter. He had the manner of a man who'd outlasted several versions of the world by being clear-eyed about all of them. "The Calloway situation is not resolved. Raines is watching for any movement that looks like distraction or softness. The Eastern Coalition? I know the Eastern Coalition. Then you know that Frank Raines has been looking for leverage for 8 months and hasn't found any, because you've never given him any." Vincent looked at him directly. "You understand what I'm saying?" "She's not leverage," Damien said. His voice had gone flat and specific. "She is the moment anyone outside this room knows she matters to you." A silence. "Does anyone outside this room know?" Damien said. "Nico knows." "I know. The driver who took her mother to the appointment, Wallace, is mine. Everyone is yours until they're not." Vincent held his gaze. "I've watched you build this for 15 years, Damien. I watched you give up every single exposure point, every personal attachment, every vulnerability that could be used against you. I watched you do it deliberately, and I understood why. I'm asking you to remember why." Damien was quiet for a long time. The penthouse around them was silent in the specific way of spaces designed by people with money. Soundproofed, climate-controlled, cut off from the ordinary ambient noise of the world below. The city was out there, 20 stories down, going on without them. "She built something with me once," Damien said. "When I was 9 years old and I had 2 cracked ribs and I didn't know how to exist in a room with another person without waiting for something to hit me. She handed me clay and didn't ask why I was there, and I spent a summer learning what it felt like not to be afraid." He paused. "I've been running an organization on fear for 15 years. I know exactly what it costs. She's the only person I've ever met who costs something different." Vincent looked at him for a long moment. "Then you have a decision to make," he said, "but make it with your eyes open, because the moment Frank Raines finds out she exists..." The phone on the counter buzzed. Both men looked at it. Damien picked it up. He looked at the screen. Something moved behind his eyes. Not fear, but something adjacent to it. The specific expression of a man watching a calculation he thought he'd controlled suddenly produce an output he didn't account for. He stood up. "What is it?" Vincent said. Damien turned the phone so Vincent could see the screen. It was a photograph. Serena Vale, outside Polly's family diner, the previous Thursday evening. The angle was long, telephoto lens taken from across the street or above. She wouldn't have known it was happening. She was standing under the awning, her bag over her shoulder, the end-of-shift look on her face, the city going dark behind her. The message below the photograph was 4 words. "We know about her." Vincent Palazzo looked at the photograph. Then he looked at Damien. Damien was already moving toward the door, his jacket off the hook before Vincent had finished standing, his phone already dialing as he hit the hallway. "Damien!" "Get Nico," Damien said. "Now!" The elevator doors closed. And in the kitchen of a Fifth Avenue penthouse, a man who had spent 15 years building a life without exposure points had just found out that someone had already found the one he'd made. The call Damien made in the elevator was to a man named Garrett, who ran the security rotation on the Greenfield neighborhood perimeter. A perimeter that, until 48 hours ago, had been theoretical, precautionary. The kind of resource you deploy, not because you believe you'll need it, but because you've spent 15 years believing that the cost of not deploying it is always higher than the cost of being wrong. Garrett picked up on the first ring. "Diner," Damien said. "Now, full rotation." "Already moving," Garrett said. "We got the flag 20 minutes ago." Damien stopped walking. "What flag?" A half-second pause that lasted approximately 1 year. "The photograph. We picked up the transmission intercept at... You had it 20 minutes ago." Sir, protocol says we verify the source before she's at the diner right now. Damien's voice had gone somewhere below flat, into a register that didn't have temperature in it. Tuesday closing shift. She's been there since 4. We're 6 minutes out. 4, Damien said and hung up. He hit the lobby at a pace that made the night doorman step back without meaning to, and pushed through the revolving door into the cold November air, where his car was already at the curb. Nico had called Wallace before Damien reached the ground floor, which was the kind of operational reflex that 9 years of working together produced. He got in. The car moved. In the back seat, Damien looked at the photograph again. The angle was elevated, above street level, east side of the block, which put the shooter in one of 2 buildings. The metadata had been stripped from the image before it was sent, which meant whoever had taken it knew what they were doing, which meant this was not a warning shot from someone working alone. This was an opening move from someone with infrastructure. Frank Rains. He'd known Rains for 11 years, which was long enough to understand the man's methodology with the precision of someone who'd studied it as a survival requirement. Rains operated through escalating demonstration. He didn't threaten, he demonstrated capability, and then he waited for the demonstration to do the work for him. The photograph was a demonstration. We know she exists, we know where she works, we know your schedule. The 4 words below it were not a demand, they were an invitation to imagine what came next. Rains was patient. He'd waited 8 months for an exposure point. Now that he had one, he wouldn't move immediately. He'd let the knowledge of his knowledge sit on Damien's chest for a few days first. Let the anxiety do the preliminary work of softening. That was his mistake. Damien Moretti did not soften. The car pulled up to Polly's at 6:42 p.m. The diner was mid-evening occupied, half the tables, the counter with 3 regulars. Through the plate glass, he could see Serena moving between tables with a coffee carafe, her back to the window. The particular economy of motion that meant she was 2 hours into a shift and running on efficiency rather than energy. Garrett's 2-man team was already on the block. One on the northeast corner, one positioned in a car on the parallel street. Damien clocked them without looking directly at either. He got out. He went inside. The bell above the door. Serena turned at the sound of it, coffee carafe in hand, and the professional warmth of her expression did its usual fractional recalibration when she saw him. Not unwelcoming, just the specific adjustment of someone who'd been maintaining a careful internal categorization of this man that his actual presence kept complicating. It's not Thursday, she said. I need 5 minutes, he said, when you have them. She looked at him. Not at his face, at his posture, his hands, the specific quality of stillness he was deploying that she'd learned in 6 weeks to read as controlled urgency. She turned and set the carafe on the counter. Marcus, she called toward the kitchen, cover for 5. She led him to the small office behind the counter. Barely a room, more of a widened corridor with a desk and a filing cabinet and a wall calendar that was 3 months behind. She closed the door. The noise of the diner went muffled and distant. She turned and looked at him. Tell me, she said. He pulled out his phone, showed her the photograph. She looked at it for a long moment. Her own face, her own awning, her own end-of-shift posture, rendered in the cold objectivity of a telephoto lens. Her hands were at her sides, and she didn't move them. When? She said. Last Thursday. The same night your driver took my mother home. Yes. She looked at the photograph for another moment. Then she looked at him. Who? A man named Frank Rains. He runs an organization that's been looking for leverage against me for the better part of a year. He watched her face. Not for fear, though fear would have been reasonable, but for the specific quality of reaction that would tell him which version of this conversation they were about to have. He found it. I'm the leverage. Yes. She handed the phone back. She turned away from him and stood facing the filing cabinet for a moment, arms crossed, not in defensiveness, but in the posture of someone doing rapid internal arithmetic with a result they haven't finished computing. Is my mother in danger? She said. Not immediately. Rains demonstrates before he acts. He's shown me he has access. He'll wait to see how I respond before he decides what to do with the access. How long do I have before not immediately becomes something else? Days, maybe a week. She turned back around. Her face was... He'd seen that expression before, he realized. Not on her. On himself. In mirrors. In the years before he'd learned to prevent it from reaching his surface. It was the expression of someone doing the thing humans do when the ground shifts and there's no stable place to put your weight. The rapid, graceless work of finding a new footing before you fall. What do you need from me? She said. I need to move you and your mother, temporarily. Somewhere I can control the perimeter. We can't just leave. My mother has appointments. I'll handle the appointments, the logistics, all of it. He held her gaze. I need you to trust me for 72 hours. That's a significant ask, she said, from a man whose life just made my mother a target. The directness of it landed clean, and he didn't flinch from it because she was right. Yes, he said, it is. She looked at him for a long time. The diner noise came through the door. Someone laughing, the clatter of plates, Marcus calling something in the kitchen. The ordinary world running parallel to this one. I'll talk to my mother tonight, she said. Give me until morning. I'll have someone outside your building tonight. I know you will, she said. And she opened the door and went back to her tables, and Damien stood in the small office for a moment looking at the wall calendar that was 3 months behind before he went back out into the cold. He should have gone back to the penthouse. Instead, he had Wallace drive him to a bar in Lawrenceville that he owned through a third-party trust, and sat at the end of the counter with a glass of whiskey. He didn't drink, and thought about the photograph and what it meant, and what had to happen next. Nico arrived at 9. He sat down without being invited and signaled the bartender for water, because Nico didn't drink when operational situations were live, a discipline Damien had always respected. He put his phone face down on the bar. Source confirmed, Nico said. Rains. The transmission originated from a relay server his people have used before. We have the location of the shooter, a building on the east side of Meredith, 4th floor, unoccupied unit. Rental was arranged through a shell 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks, Damien said. He's been watching for at least 3 weeks. Damien looked at his glass. How much does he have? The photograph, your schedule at the diner, the Tuesday-Thursday pattern. Probably the Penn Avenue meeting. Nico paused. Wallace. Damien looked up. Nico's face was exactly what it always was. Controlled, precise, delivering information in the tone of a man who understood that how you said a thing shaped how it was received, and who had chosen to say this thing with the flatness of someone who'd already done the ugly work of verification. I'm sorry, Nico said. He's been feeding Rain's location data for 6 weeks, since the second diner visit. The bar around them continued doing what bars do. Low music, glasses moving, someone at a table near the window telling a story that required both hands to illustrate. The world going on. Damien was quiet. Wallace, he said. His brother owes Rains' organization a significant debt. They used it. Nico's voice didn't change. He's been removed from rotation. He's being held. Where? The Lawrenceville facility. Damien picked up his glass, set it back down without drinking. He drove her mother to the appointment. Yes. He knows where her mother lives. Yes. The silence between them had a specific weight to it. Not the weight of surprise, because neither of them had the luxury of surprise, but the weight of a situation that had just gotten a precise amount worse than it had been 3 minutes ago. What does Rains want? Damien said. It wasn't really a question. Based on the pattern. The Eastern Coalition vote is in 3 weeks. He needs you out of the room. If you're managing a personal crisis, you're not managing the coalition. Nico folded his hands on the bar. He doesn't need to hurt her. He just needs you to be afraid that he will. He miscalculated what I do when I'm afraid, Damien said. I know that, Nico said. He doesn't. A pause. The Lawrenceville facility, Damien said. What did Wallace give them? Addresses, schedules, the Penn Avenue building's ownership trail. Nico looked at him steadily. And the specialist appointment. Center Avenue, the time, the car. Damien was still. Her mother's name and condition, Nico continued, because he believed in completing the inventory, even when it was painful to do it. The medication schedule, the name of the doctor, everything. 6 weeks of careful, peripheral proximity, and Wallace had handed Rains a complete operational file on the one person Damien had allowed himself to. He stopped the thought before it finished. That was not the productive direction. The productive direction was forward. Move them tonight, Damien said. Don't wait for morning. Serena said, I know what she said. Move them tonight. He stood, leaving the untouched whiskey on the bar. And get me a meeting with Rains. Nico looked at him. A meeting. Not his kind. Mine. He pulled on his jacket. 48 hours. Damien, if you move on Reigns directly before the coalition vote, it reads as, I know how it reads. He looked at Nico with the flat, specific look that ended conversations. Set the meeting. He left. Serena was in her mother's room when the knock came. It was 11:20 p.m. She'd been home for 2 hours, had made her mother's evening medication, had sat on the edge of the bed and watched the documentary about migration patterns that her mother had pulled up without comment, which was Caroline's way of providing a space that didn't require speech. She'd almost told her mother about the photograph 3 times and hadn't done it yet, because she was still working out how to say the man I've been allowing myself to care about has brought his war to our door in a way that didn't sound exactly like what it was. The knock was quiet. 3 beats, evenly spaced. Not police. Police knocked differently. She went to the door without turning on the hall light, looked through the peephole. A woman. Mid-30s, compact, dark jacket, short hair. Serena didn't recognize her. She had the kind of stance that didn't perform anything, just stood there, weight balanced, no theater in it. Ms. Vale. The voice was low, clear. My name is Carla. Mr. Moretti asked me to come. I need you to pack a bag for yourself and your mother. We need to leave in the next 20 minutes. Serena stared through the peephole. He said tonight was too soon, she said through the door. The situation changed, Carla said. He'll explain when we get there. I need 20 minutes. Serena pressed her hand flat against the door for a moment. Then she unlocked it. The safe house was in Fox Chapel, a neighborhood of old money and wide lots and houses set back from the road behind mature trees that were good for privacy in ways that had nothing to do with real estate value. The house itself was a large colonial that had been modified in ways not visible from the street. Reinforced doors, window treatments that were not merely decorative, a layout that Serena didn't know enough about to fully read, but that felt, in the way that spaces communicated their purpose, like somewhere that took security seriously. Carla installed Caroline in a ground-floor bedroom with its own bathroom and a view of a garden that was brown and dormant in November, but which, Caroline observed without irony, had good bones. Serena sat in the kitchen and waited. Damien arrived at 12:40 a.m. He came in through a side entrance, Nico a half step behind him, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her in a way that told her 2 things simultaneously. That he was relieved she was there, and that whatever he was about to tell her was going to be worse than the photograph. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands around a mug of tea that had gone cold. She looked at him. Sit down, she said. He sat. Tell me what changed, she said. He told her about Wallace. She listened without interrupting. Her face was doing the thing it did when she was processing information that required her to revise a framework. Very still, not cold, but the specific quality of a person using all available resources for comprehension and leaving none for performance. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. 6 weeks, she said. Yes. He drove my mother to her appointment. Yes. He knows where she lives, her doctor's name, her medication. Yes. She looked at the cold tea. Then she looked at him. How did you not know? She said. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. The flat, honest question of someone who needed to understand the mechanism of the failure. His brother's debt gave Reigns leverage I didn't know existed, Damien said. I run background on my people. I don't run background on their families. That was a gap. A gap, she said. Yes. My mother is a gap. Serena. I'm not... She stopped. She set down the mug. She pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment, at her own hands. And he watched her do the thing he'd seen her do before, the rapid, graceless internal work of finding footing. I'm not angry at you, she said. I'm angry at the situation. I need to be precise about that right now because I don't have the bandwidth to be imprecise. She looked up. What happens next? I'm meeting with Reigns. What does that mean? It means I remove the threat. How? He held her gaze. In the way I know how to remove threats. A silence. She understood what he was saying. She'd known for 6 weeks what he was, what the name meant, what the empire was built on. She'd held that knowledge carefully in a separate part of her mind, and managed the distance between it and the part of her that sat in coffee shops and talked about buildings, and felt something warming in her chest that she'd been too carefully not naming. She'd maintained that distance the way you maintain the distance between 2 live wires, not because you don't know they're both there, but because you understand that the gap between them is doing critical work. The gap was gone now. You told me one honest step forward, she said. You told me you weren't asking for a decision about what you are. I know what I said. What you are put my mother in a safe house at midnight. Her voice was still level, but something in it had changed. Not broken, not sharp, but the sound of something carrying a load. It had been designed to carry, but was feeling the weight of now, fully, without any of the usual distribution. I need you to tell me that she's going to be okay. Not, I don't need the mechanics, I need the truth. She's going to be okay, he said. Is that a fact or a promise? Both, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen around them was very quiet, the house settling, the November wind outside, the distant sound of her mother's television through the closed door. I don't regret the creek, she said. I don't regret the coffee shop. I don't regret... She stopped. But I need you to understand that whatever you're about to do, whatever it costs, I need to know it's the last time my mother is collateral for a life she never chose to be part of. It will be, he said. That's another promise. Yes. She looked at him. The thing in her chest that she'd spent weeks carefully not naming was still there. She could feel it, unchanged, which was the most disorienting part. The fear and the anger and the exhaustion were all present and real and justified, and underneath them, stubbornly intact, was the thing that had been there since a man came into a diner in the rain and handed her back a piece of her own childhood. Go do what you have to do, she said. He stood. At the doorway he stopped. He didn't turn around. I'm sorry, he said. I know, she said. He left. She sat in the kitchen for a long time after the side door closed, her hands around the cold mug, and she thought about what her mother had said on the bus. Men who look at someone like that are capable of burning everything down when they believe it's in danger. She hadn't understood it then as prediction. Somewhere across the city, a man named Frank Rains was sitting inside the assumption that Damien Moretti could be controlled through fear of losing something. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. And in a Fox Chapel kitchen, Serena Vale sat with the wreckage of her careful emotional accounting spread around her and understood, with the clarity that only arrives after the thing you were afraid of has already happened, that the distance she'd been maintaining between who Damien was and what she felt about him had not been protection. It had been a delay. That was all. Not protection, a delay. Serena sat with that understanding in the Fox Chapel kitchen until the cold got specific enough to pull her back into her body, and then she got up, rinsed the mug, and went to check on her mother. Caroline was awake. She was sitting up against the pillows in the unfamiliar room with the television off and her hands folded in her lap, which was what she did when she was thinking hard enough that external input would be interference. She looked at Serena when the door opened, and she didn't ask where they were or why, which meant she'd already done most of that work herself. He left, Caroline said. Yes. To handle it. Yes. Caroline looked at her daughter for a long moment with the clear, unguarded assessment that had always been her particular instrument. You're not going to fall apart, she said. Not a question. No, Serena said. Good. Caroline shifted against the pillows. Then come sit with me and stop standing in the doorway like you're deciding whether to stay. Serena came in, sat on the edge of the bed. The room was warm and quiet, and outside the window the November garden sat in the dark, its bare structure patient and without apology. Mom, Serena said. I know, Caroline said. I know, her mother said again, and the gentleness in it was the specific gentleness of someone who'd watched their child arrive at a thing they couldn't be warned away from and had decided long ago to be present for the landing instead. They sat together in the quiet room and didn't say anything else about it, and that was enough. Damien's meeting with Frank Rains was set for Thursday. In the 40 hours between the Fox Chapel kitchen and Thursday, the Moretti organization moved with the precision of a machine that had been built for exactly this kind of pressure and had been waiting, in the idle way of well-maintained engines, for the load to arrive. Nico ran the operational side. He mapped Rains's Pittsburgh infrastructure with the resources of a man who'd been quietly building that map for 8 months. Not because he'd known this day was coming, but because Nico Reyes had spent his professional life understanding that the map you needed was always the one you'd drawn before you needed it. 3 safe houses, 2 offices, a distribution hub in the Strip District that operated behind the front of an import business. 14 people in Raines's active Pittsburgh rotation. Damien went through the intelligence the way he went through every operational brief, methodically, without drama, asking questions where the picture had gaps, and not asking questions where it didn't. He slept 4 hours Wednesday night in one of the Fox Chapel House's upper rooms, which was 4 hours more than Nico slept, and he was at the kitchen table at 6 a.m. with coffee and the final brief spread in front of him when Garrett came in to tell him the perimeter was clean. "She's awake," Garrett said. Damien didn't look up from the papers. "I know." He'd heard her at 5:30, the sound of the kettle, the particular quiet of someone moving through an unfamiliar house without wanting to wake anyone, getting their bearings. He'd stayed in the kitchen and let her have the space. There were things that needed doing before there was room for the conversation that was waiting between them. At 6:15, she came into the kitchen. She was in yesterday's clothes, her hair down, the specific stripped quality of someone who hadn't slept enough but had decided not to perform the exhaustion. She looked at the papers on the table, at the coffee, at him. She poured herself a cup and sat down across from him. "Today," she said. "Tonight," he said. "The meeting is at 10. "Where?" "A warehouse in the Strip District. Neutral ground, technically. He'll have people. I'll have people." And then, he looked at her across the table. "And then it's over." She held his gaze. "You said that like it's simple." "It's not simple," he said, "but it's clear. Those are different things." She wrapped her hands around her mug. "I want to know when it's done." "You'll know. I want you to call me." "Serena, when it's done," she said. "I want you to call me yourself. Not Garrett, not Nico. You." She looked at him with the direct, undecorated steadiness he'd spent 15 years trying to find in other contexts and never had. "Because I need to know that you're okay, not just that it's handled." He was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said. She nodded once, looked at her coffee, and then she looked back up and said, "The Penn Avenue building, second floor, east unit, the room with the best light. I put the ceiling height at 14 feet and the windows running floor to the cornice. You'd want to keep the original frame detailing, add interior shutters rather than curtains, use the natural shadow variation to define the space rather than fighting it." She paused. "I finished the concept drawings last week. They're on my laptop at the apartment." He looked at her. "I'm telling you," she said, "because I want there to be a Thursday. I want there to be a version of this where we go back to that building and I walk you through the drawings and we argue about the staircase balustrade." Her voice was level and her eyes were direct, and the thing behind them was the thing he'd spent 15 years not believing was available to him. "So come back." He held her gaze for a long time. "I'll come back," he said. The Strip District at 9:40 p.m. was the particular kind of urban industrial quiet that belongs to neighborhoods that work hard during the day and go entirely dark at night. Loading docks, shuttered storefronts, the skeletal geometry of chain-link fencing under sodium lights. The river 2 blocks south, invisible but present. You could feel it in the air, the cold damp of moving water. The warehouse belonged to a freight company that was, in the specific technical sense, a real freight company. It moved real goods, employed real workers, filed real taxes. It also served, in the way that many useful buildings serve, as a space where the city's subterranean economy conducted its periodic negotiations. Both sides had used it before. Both sides had agreed to it, which meant both sides had agreed to the implied convention of a neutral space. No first moves, no ambushes. The meeting ends when both parties leave. Damien arrived first. He came with Nico, Garrett, and 2 others. Marco and a man everyone called Chev, who'd been with the organization for 7 years and had the specific value of being very good at reading a room's geometry before anything happened in it. They took positions inside the warehouse's main floor, a vast concrete space under steel beam ceilings, single industrial lights throwing hard shadows, the smell of machine oil and old wood and cold air seeping through the loading bay doors. Damien stood in the center of the space and waited. Raines came in at 10:02. Frank Raines was 51 years old, medium height, the kind of build that had been substantial in his 40s, and was beginning the slow renegotiation with gravity. He had a head of gray hair he kept short, and a face that had settled into the particular arrangement of a man who'd spent 30 years in rooms where the outcome depended on not showing anything. He came with 5 people, which was one more than Damien had, which was deliberate. A small, careful establishment of numerical advantage that communicated confidence without aggression. Rains understood the grammar of these encounters. He stopped 8 feet from Damien. The two men looked at each other in the industrial light. Damien, Rains said. His voice was even and conversational, the voice of a man attending a business meeting. Frank, Damien said. A pause. I appreciate you making time, Rains said. You made the time, Damien said. The photograph was an invitation. I thought of it more as an introduction. Rains tilted his head slightly. You've kept your personal life very clean for a long time. I always respected that. I was surprised to find the door open. What do you want? Damien said. Rains looked at him for a moment. The performance of consideration. The beat that was designed to communicate that whatever came next had been thought through, that this was a reasonable man presenting a reasonable proposition. The Eastern Coalition vote, Rains said. I want your abstention. No. The word dropped into the space between them and Rains absorbed it without visible reaction. That's your immediate response, he said. I understand that. But consider. I've considered it, Damien said. No. You have things to lose now. Rains's voice didn't change register. That changes the math. You think it does? A woman. Her sick mother. Rains spread his hands slightly. The gesture of a man laying out the obvious with reluctant clarity. These are people who can be reached, Damien. I don't want to reach them. I want to be very clear about that. I'm not a man who targets civilians. But the capability exists, and you understand that the existence of the capability changes the conversation. The warehouse was very quiet. Damien looked at Rains across 8 feet of concrete floor, and he felt something moving through him that he'd learned to recognize over many years as the specific signal of a moment that would be remembered. Not because of what was about to happen, but because of what he was about to choose. He'd been in rooms like this before. He'd felt this quality of silence before. The compressed pre-event stillness of everything arranged and waiting. You surveilled a woman who serves soup for $12 an hour, Damien said. You put a camera on her building and you followed her mother to a medical appointment. You gathered information on a sick woman's medication schedule. His voice was absolutely level. And then you sat on it for 3 weeks because you thought I'd be afraid. I thought you'd be rational, Rains said. Let me tell you what I am, Damien said. I'm a man who spent 15 years building an organization that has no exposure points because I believed that was the price of doing this work cleanly. No family, no attachments, no doors. You waited 8 months for a door to open, and when it did, you walked through it. A pause. That was your mistake. Rains's face did something very small. A compression at the corners of his eyes, the micro-expression of a man recalibrating. I don't see the mistake. The mistake, Damien said, is that you looked at her and saw a vulnerability. You should have looked at her and understood that she's the reason I don't have to be careful about this anymore. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Rains said, Take him. And the warehouse stopped being a meeting. Rains's 5 men moved with the coordination of people who'd rehearsed this. Not the meeting, but the meeting's failure, which they'd apparently considered a reasonable probability. The nearest one came at Damien from the right, and Damien moved left and took the man's arm as it came up and redirected it with the specific mechanical efficiency of someone who'd learned this language young and had never had reason to unlearn it. The man went down hard on the concrete, and Damien was already moving to the next one. Garrett engaged 2 of Rains's people simultaneously on the far side of the space, his training evident in the economy of it. No wasted motion. Marco cut off the retreat toward the loading bay door. Chev had positioned himself near the only overhead light panel on his side of the room. Rains himself hadn't moved. He stood with his hands at his sides, watching the room come apart around him with the expression of a man who had several more moves and was deciding which one the situation called for. Damien reached him in 4 seconds. He took Rains by the collar of his jacket and walked him backward until his shoulders hit the concrete wall, and the impact wasn't gentle, but it was deliberate. Controlled force, not rage, which was an important distinction that Damien had spent 20 years understanding. Rains's face was doing something now that it hadn't been doing 8 feet away. The composed surface was still there, but the thing underneath it was visible. The specific animal calculation of a man reassessing a situation that was going differently than he'd modeled. The coalition vote, Damien said. He was barely breathing harder than normal. You want my abstention. I want something in exchange. Rains looked at him. You're not in a position to negotiate. I'm the only one in this room who is, Damien said. Your 5 people are down. My 4 are standing. I have your primary Pittsburgh operation mapped to the building level. He held Raines's gaze from 8 inches away. You have nothing. The photograph bought you this meeting. This meeting bought you one option. Raines said nothing. Walk away from Pittsburgh, Damien said. Not from the coalition. I don't care about the vote the way you think I do. Walk away from Pittsburgh entirely. Take your infrastructure and your people and your leverage attempts and conduct your business somewhere else. And if I don't? Then I stop being careful, Damien said. And I've been very careful for a very long time. You've seen what careful looks like. Use your imagination for the alternative. The warehouse was almost entirely quiet now. Garrett's breathing from across the room. The low industrial hum of the lighting. Raines's men on the floor in various states of recovery, none of them moving toward anything useful. Raines looked at Damien for a long moment. You'd walk away from the coalition over a woman, he said. I'd burn the coalition down, Damien said. It's not about the vote. I told you. I don't have to be careful about this anymore. He held the man's gaze with the flat, specific intensity of someone delivering information rather than a threat. She handed me clay when I was 9 years old, and I had 2 cracked ribs and no language for what was being done to me at home. And she didn't ask a single question. She just let me build something. He paused. I've been building things in her direction for 27 years without knowing it. You put a camera on her building. His voice dropped 1 register. Leave Pittsburgh, Frank. Tonight. And don't give me a reason to look for you. Raines looked at him for 5 full seconds. Then he said, Let go of my jacket. Damien released him, stepped back, straightened. Raines adjusted his collar. He looked around the room at his people in the unflattering geometry of having lost. Then he looked back at Damien, and in his face was the specific expression of a man filing something away. Not surrendering it, filing it, which was the most honest thing he'd shown all night. Pittsburgh, Raines said. By morning, Damien said. Raines walked to the loading bay door. 2 of his people helped a third to his feet and followed. The door rolled open on the cold night air and the smell of the river, and then they were gone, and the door rolled shut behind them, and the warehouse was silent again. Nico appeared at Damien's shoulder. Clean? Damien said. Clean, Nico said. Marco's on the exterior, no secondary units. A pause. He'll be out of Pittsburgh by morning. He can't afford not to be. I know, but he filed it away, Nico said. I know that too. Damien looked at the loading bay door. It buys time. Time is what I need. Time for what? Nico said. Damien reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone. He pulled up Serena's number. The phone rang twice. It's done, he said when she picked up. His voice was even and quiet, and she could hear in it the specific quality of someone who'd just come through something and was still standing. Are you and your mother okay? Yes, she said. Her voice was, she'd been awake. He'd known she would be. Are you? He stood in the Strip District warehouse with the smell of concrete and cold air and the distant river, and he thought about ceiling heights and the east-facing windows and a woman who'd sat across a kitchen table from him at 6 in the morning and told him she wanted there to be a Thursday. Yes, he said. Come back, she said. He was already moving toward the door. But in the pocket of his jacket, his other phone, the one that ran the organization, the one that had been running it for 15 years, was buzzing with a message from Vincent Palazzo that he hadn't opened yet, and when he opened it in the car on the way back to Fox Chapel, the message was 4 words that landed in the base of his chest like something shifting in the foundation of a building that had seemed, until this moment, the message from Vincent Palazzo was 4 words. They voted without you. Damien sat in the back of the car on the way to Fox Chapel and read it twice, not because he needed to read it twice to understand it, but because the mind sometimes requires a second pass to accept what it already knows. The Eastern Coalition vote, the one Raines had wanted him absent from, the one that had been the architectural purpose of the entire surveillance operation, the photograph, the leveraged driver, all of it, had been moved up by 48 hours and conducted without him, while he'd been managing the crisis that had been specifically engineered to keep him away from the table. He called Vincent. Vincent picked up on the first ring, which meant he'd been waiting. When? Damien said. This evening, 6 o'clock. Kendall's offices in Shadyside. Vincent's voice was winter flat in the way it got when the news was bad enough that tone became irrelevant. 7 votes to 4. Raines had proxies in the room, 2 members I didn't know he'd turned. The outcome. The Hargrove territory goes to Raines's coalition. The distribution network restructures under their oversight starting January 1st. A pause. Your Eastern Corridor contracts are effectively nullified. Damien watched Pittsburgh go by outside the window. The bridges. The river. The lights of the city on the water. He played it from both ends, Damien said. Yes. The confrontation tonight was the distraction. The vote was always the objective. Vincent paused again. He knew you'd respond to the photograph. He built a scenario that forced you to choose between the coalition and the woman, knowing that whichever you chose, he'd have the other. The car moved through the Fox Chapel darkness, the sodium lights thinning out as the neighborhood got quieter and more expensive. He didn't know which I'd choose, Damien said. No, Vincent said. I think he expected you to choose the coalition, to send someone else to manage the personal situation and attend the vote yourself. A beat. He underestimated the creek. Damien almost said something. Didn't. What's the exposure? He said instead. Significant. The Eastern Corridor was 30% of clean revenue. The restructuring cuts our legitimate business pipeline by... Nico has the exact numbers, but the short version is that the organization as currently structured becomes significantly harder to sustain without returning to methods we've been moving away from. The car stopped in the Fox Chapel driveway. Or, Vincent said. Damien waited. Or the organization changes structure, Vincent said. Substantially, which you've been thinking about anyway. Raines may have just forced the timeline. Damien sat in the parked car for a long moment. Through the front windows of the house, he could see the warm light of the kitchen. And he thought about a woman sitting up waiting. And he thought about 30% of clean revenue. And he thought about a warehouse in the Strip District and a man who'd filed something away rather than surrendering it. And he thought about the very specific and well-documented problem of winning a battle and losing the thing the battle was fought over. Get me a meeting with the 4 who voted with us, he said. Tomorrow. I'll set it, Vincent said. And Vincent. Damien looked at the kitchen light. I need an attorney. Not the organization's attorney. A private one. Corporate restructuring. Legitimate business transfers. The works. A silence. You're sure, Vincent said. Set the meeting, Damien said, and got out of the car. What? Serena was at the kitchen table when he came in. She'd made coffee. Real coffee, not the middle-of-the-night tea, which told him something about where she was. And she had a notebook open in front of her with the Penn Avenue floor concept sketched in rough lines. She'd been working while she waited, which was the most purely Serena thing he could have walked in to find, and the sight of it did something specific in his chest. She looked up when he came through the side door. She looked at his face. What happened? She said. He sat down across from her. He told her about the vote. She listened the way she always listened, completely, without interruption, her pen set down on the notebook. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, her hands flat on the table, and he watched her process it with the particular directness of someone who'd spent years developing the ability to receive bad news without the luxury of denial. So he won, she said. He won the vote, Damien said. Tonight was him showing me what I'd spent to get there, what I'd traded. The Eastern Corridor. 30% of clean revenue. Probably more before the restructuring settles. She looked at him. And the organization. Changes, he said. Has to. He held her gaze. I've been moving toward it for 2 years, slower than I should have. Raines just removed the option of moving slowly. She absorbed that. Is that dangerous, the change? Yes, he said. There are people inside the organization who benefit from the current structure. People outside it who'll see the restructuring as weakness and try to move into the space. He paused. It will be a difficult year. How difficult? I don't know exactly. Difficult enough that I need to be honest with you about what this costs. If you stay in this, what the next year looks like. She looked at him steadily. You're giving me a way out. I'm giving you the information you need to decide, he said. That's different. She looked at her hands for a moment, then she looked back up. What does the attorney do? She said. The corporate restructuring one. He blinked. How did you... Your face when you came in, she said. You'd already made a decision before you told me about the vote. I wanted to hear it in order, but... She stopped. What does the attorney do? Starts the process of separating the legitimate businesses from the rest, he said. Property holdings, the development projects, the clean revenue streams. Build a wall between them and the part of the organization that can't be cleaned. Over time, the legitimate side grows and the other side, he paused, atrophies. How long? Years, 3, 5, maybe more. And the difficult year in between is real, he said. I won't tell you it isn't. She was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the Penn Avenue drawings on the table between them. The rough lines of the floor plan, the ceiling heights noted in her handwriting in the margins, the east window detail she'd sketched 3 times before she was satisfied with it. She'd been working on this for weeks, on her own time, in her own notebook, without being asked to continue after the safe house, without any guarantee that there would be a building to design or a man who'd come back from a strip district warehouse to care about the drawings. She'd done it anyway, because she was the kind of person who built things. The second floor east unit, she said. I put a reading alcove in the window bay. It's not structural. It's cosmetic, built millwork, maybe 18 inches of depth. But it changes how the room feels. It makes the window into a destination instead of just a feature. She looked up from the drawings. That's what I want. I want to be a destination, not a feature of your life that you have to protect. He looked at her. I want to work, she said. On the building. On others, if there are others. I want to finish the degree. I want my mother to stop being a logistical problem that lives at the edge of a criminal organization's operational picture. Her voice was level and direct, and had the weight of someone who'd spent a sleepless night doing the arithmetic and was now presenting the results. I want the things I gave up to have not been permanent. I want the person I was going to be still be available. She held his gaze. Can you give me that? Not as a promise, as a realistic assessment. He looked at her across the kitchen table, at the rough drawings between them, at the woman who'd handed a damaged 9-year-old a piece of clay without asking why and who had been, in one way or another, giving him the material to build with ever since. The degree. I can make that happen. The building needs a designer. He paused. Your mother's care. The specialists, the medications, the appointments. I can cover that. Fully. Without it ever touching anything that could put her in a safe house again. He held her gaze. The rest is harder to promise because I don't fully control it, but the direction is right. The decision is made. She looked at him for a long moment. I'm going to hold you to the direction, she said. I know, he said. I'm not going to be easy about it. I know that too, he said. The corner of her mouth moved, the involuntary thing she usually pressed back down. She didn't press it down this time. Go sleep, she said. You look like something that's been through a warehouse. Accurate, he said. She gathered the drawings and closed the notebook and stood up, and she looked at him one more time across the kitchen table with the specific expression he'd been seeing on her face for 2 months and had been building a vocabulary for, the look of someone who'd spent years pointing into the wind and had just, very recently, and with full knowledge of the cost, decided to turn around. She went down the hall to her room. He sat in the kitchen for a few more minutes with the coffee she'd made going cold in front of him, and he thought about Vincent's voice when he'd said, "You're sure," and he thought about the look on Raines's face when he'd filed something away, and he thought about a difficult year and the specific, untheoretical weight of what he'd traded tonight. Then he thought about 18 inches of millwork and a window turned into a destination. He drank the cold coffee. He went to sleep. Wallace was let go in December. Not in the way that, 6 months earlier, being let go from the Moretti organization would have meant. Damien sat across from him in a room in the Lawrenceville facility and looked at a man who had done something unforgivable for reasons that were completely understandable, which was one of the more difficult categories of human behavior to navigate, and he said, "Your brother's debt to Raines is cleared. It was cleared 2 days ago. You're free to go." Wallace looked at him. His face was the face of a man waiting for the other half of the sentence. "That's it," Damien said. "I fed them your schedule for 6 weeks," Wallace said. I know what you did." Damien held his gaze. "You did it because they had your brother. I would have done the same." A pause. "You're not in this work anymore. That's the consequence. But you go home." Wallace sat very still for a moment. Then he nodded once and stood and left. And Damien sat in the room alone for a minute, thinking about the specific, imprecise mercy of understanding why someone did what they did without pretending it didn't matter that they'd done it. He was getting better at holding those two things at the same time. The attorney's name was Patricia Holt. She was 58, sharp as a surgical instrument, and had spent 30 years in corporate restructuring with the particular expertise of someone who understood that the legal architecture of a business was always a reflection of the intentions of the person who'd built it, and that changing the intentions required rebuilding from the foundation. She met with Damien 4 times in December. After the third meeting, she looked at him across the conference table and said, "You understand that this process is going to be visible. People will draw conclusions." "I know," he said. "Some of those people will see it as an opportunity." "I know that too." "Then I want to make sure you understand that the legal process can protect you from a lot of things, but it can't protect you from that." "I'm not looking for protection," he said. "I'm looking for a structure that can support what I'm building. The protection is a separate problem." Holt looked at him for a moment. "What are you building?" she said, not as a professional question, but as something more direct. He thought about Penn Avenue, about ceiling heights and east-facing windows, and a woman in a reading alcove 18 inches deep. "Something worth protecting," he said. Serena enrolled in the interior design program in January. It was a continuation program. She'd kept her transfer credits from the 2 years she'd completed before her mother's first hospitalization, and the department chair, a compact man in his 60s named Professor Lim, who had the specific dry enthusiasm of someone who'd loved his subject for 40 years without the love wearing down, had reviewed her portfolio and told her she was further along than she thought. She'd shown him the Penn Avenue concept drawings at the end of the meeting, not because she'd planned to, but because he'd asked what she'd been working on, and she'd answered honestly. He'd looked at them for a long time. "Who taught you this approach?" he said. "Nobody," she said. "I just looked at the building." He looked at her over his glasses. "That's the only answer I accept," he said. "Most people learn to look at buildings by learning to look at buildings the way other people look at buildings. You're going to have to unlearn some of that instinct and rebuild it with vocabulary, but the underlying vision," he tapped the drawing, "that stays." She'd walked out of that meeting into the January cold with the specific dizzying quality of someone who'd been carrying a weight for so long that its removal felt not like relief, but like vertigo. She'd stood on the sidewalk outside the university building for 30 seconds. Then she'd taken out her phone and called her mother. "It's official," she said. Caroline Vale, sitting in the Fox Chapel house that had become, by a gradual and unannounced process, the place where she and Serena were now living. A process that had involved approximately 1 direct conversation and several weeks of belongings migrating from Meredith Street, said, "I know. I haven't started yet. I might be terrible at the formal." "Serena," her mother said. "What?" "You built frog houses at 7 years old because you believed it mattered to make good ones." A pause. "You were never going to be terrible at this." Serena stood on the cold sidewalk and breathed. "Okay," she said. "Come home," her mother said. "I'm making soup." Frank Raines was out of Pittsburgh by the end of January. Not by choice, exactly, or not only by choice. The difficult year that Damien had described to Serena across the Fox Chapel kitchen table arrived in February with the accuracy of a predicted storm, and it was exactly as difficult as promised. 2 members of the organization's inner structure who'd been profiting from the old model left, one quietly and one with a certain amount of noise that required managing. A rival operation in the Ohio corridor tested the perimeter twice in March, both times withdrawn when the response was more organized than they'd anticipated. Nico ran the operational side with the same precise, exhausted competence he'd been running it with for 9 years. He and Damien had a conversation in February that lasted 3 hours and covered the specific, honest territory of what the restructuring meant for the organization's people, who was willing to move toward the legitimate side, who wasn't, and how to handle the latter with as little damage as possible. Nico sat at the end of that conversation with his hands folded on the desk and looked at Damien. "You're really doing it," he said. "I've been doing it for 2 years," Damien said. "You've been managing toward it," Nico said. "This is different. This is... You made a decision." Damien looked at him. "Was that unclear before?" "Yes," Nico said. Then, "No, I don't know." He paused. "I think I knew what you wanted. I wasn't sure you believed you could have it." He looked at his hands. She changed that. Damien was quiet for a moment. She didn't change it, he said. She was always the proof that it was possible. I spent a long time not looking directly at the proof. Nico nodded once. I'm going to need a different job eventually, he said. I know, Damien said. I'll make sure it's a good one. The Penn Avenue building broke ground on renovation in April. Serena was on site the first morning, not as the designer of record, which she wouldn't be for another year and a half until she finished the continuation program and obtained the necessary credentials, but as the design consultant working under a licensed firm that Damien had retained specifically because their lead architect was a woman named Julia Crane, who'd looked at Serena's concept drawings and said, with the direct appreciation of one professional recognizing something real in another, "You see space. That's not teachable. Don't let anyone teach it out of you." Serena stood on the Penn Avenue sidewalk in an April morning that was trying hard to be warm and only partially succeeding, a coffee in one hand and a rolled set of drawings under her arm, and watched the first crew go through the building's front door. Damien stood beside her. They stood in silence for a minute, the way they'd learned to stand together, without filling the space, letting it be what it was. "The staircase balustrade," she said. "What about it?" "I want to restore the original profile, but in steel rather than wood. It keeps the visual line, but it's honest about the fact that the building has moved through time. It's not pretending to be something it was." He looked at the building's facade. "Do it." "I haven't priced the steel fabrication yet." "Do it anyway," he said. She looked at him sidelong. "You can't just say do it anyway every time I raise a budget concern." "I can," he said, "until you're the one signing the checks, at which point you can say it." She pressed her mouth together. The involuntary thing. "Professor Lim says I might be able to test out of 2 of the remaining credits," she said. "Portfolio review in October." "October," he said. "October," she said. They stood on the Penn Avenue sidewalk in the April morning and watched the building begin the work of becoming what it had always had the potential to be, and the city moved around them the way cities move. Without noticing, without pausing, the irreversible forward motion of a place that has survived too much to be stopped by any one thing's beginning or ending. Caroline Vale had a good spring. The adjusted medication protocol that Dr. Osei had implemented in January was working. Not dramatically, not the way recoveries work in stories where the body simply decides to cooperate, but in the real way, the incremental way, the way that shows up in blood work and inflammation markers, and the fact that she made it through April without a specialist visit, which had not happened in 3 years. She was sitting in the Fox Chapel garden on the first genuinely warm day in May, in a chair that Damien had bought specifically because it had the right back support and the right height for someone whose joints required negotiation, with a book open in her lap and the sun on her face. When Damien came out with 2 glasses of water and sat in the chair across from her, she looked at him over the top of her book. "You're checking on me," she said. "I'm sitting in the garden," he said. "You don't sit in gardens." "I'm learning." She looked at him for a moment with the clear assessment she'd been applying to him for 6 months. Not unfriendly, but honest. The gaze of a woman who'd known his father and had watched him become something that required updating her entire framework for what was inherited and what was chosen. "She's happy," Caroline said. "I want you to know I see that. I'm not a person who ignores things when they're true just because I'd rather they weren't." "I know," he said. "She was not happy before. She was functional. Those are different things." She looked back at her book. "Don't make me regret acknowledging that." "I won't," he said. She turned a page. "You look like him sometimes," she said, without looking up. "The jaw. Your father's jaw." She paused. "But you sound nothing like him. You never did, even when you were 9. She turned another page. "I used to watch from the window sometimes. That summer. The 2 of you down at the creek." She was quiet for a moment. "I was glad she had you there. She was always trying to give something away, even then. It's better when there's someone to give it to." Damien sat with that for a moment. "She gave away a wall," he said. "She gave away the south side that kept collapsing," Caroline said, with the precision of a woman who remembered exactly what her 7-year-old had told her. She closed the book. "And you built it, and it held." She looked at him. "That's the whole story, isn't it? Everything else is just what happened in between." The garden was quiet around them. A bird somewhere in the bare-leafed April trees. The distant sound of the city beyond the property's edge, running on without them. Damien looked at the garden and thought about the whole story and decided that she was right. In September, 6 months after the renovation broke ground, the Penn Avenue building's first two completed units came to life. They were on the second floor, the east side, the ones with the best light, the ones Serena had designed around the window bays and the original arched frames, and the principle that a room should know what it was. The reading alcove had been built exactly as drawn, 18 inches of millwork in the window bay, lined in a warm-toned wood that picked up the patina of the original floors, narrow enough to be intimate and deep enough to matter. Serena stood in the finished room on a September morning with the light coming through the east windows in the low-angle specific way she'd known it would, gold and precise, striping the restored hardwood in the bands of warmth and shadow that changed as the day moved. And she stood in the center of the room for a long moment without speaking. Then she walked to the reading alcove and sat in it, looked out the window at Penn Avenue below, the coffee cart on the corner, the sidewalk, the city doing what it did. Damien was standing in the doorway behind her. She looked out the window for a while. He didn't interrupt. "It's right," she said finally. "It is," he said. She turned and looked at the room from the alcove, the way the space organized itself around the window, the way the proportions held at the ceiling height she'd argued for, the way the staircase was visible through the open door and the steel balustrade caught the light from below. "I want to do more of these," she said. "I have 3 more buildings in the portfolio that need this kind of attention," he said. She looked at him. "I'm not doing them as a favor." "I know. I mean professionally, contracted, with Julia's firm until I have my credential and then on my own terms." "I know," he said. "I already talked to Julia." She looked at him for a moment. "When?" "June," he said. "That was 3 months ago." "I didn't want to tell you before the unit was finished," he said. "I wanted you to see it first. I wanted you to know it was real before anyone told you what came next." She looked at him in the doorway of the room she'd designed, in the building she'd walked through on a cold Saturday morning when she'd still been trying to decide whether hope was something she could afford, and she felt the thing in her chest that she'd stopped trying to name because naming it had become less necessary than simply inhabiting it. "Come sit in the alcove," she said. "It fits too." He crossed the room. It fit too, barely. Shoulders touching, the window in front of them, the city below, the gold September light, doing what she'd known it would do. They sat in it for a while. "The south side held," she said. He turned to look at her. "Of the frog house," she said. "After you built it. That whole summer. The south side didn't collapse again." He looked at her for a moment. "I didn't know that," he said. "You moved before the summer ended," she said. "You didn't get to see it." She looked out the window. But it held. Outside, Pittsburgh moved through September in the particular way of a city that has been through things and is still here, pragmatic and unglamorous and specific, the river running cold and fast under the bridges, the light changing on the brick and the water, the ordinary, irreversible motion of a place that doesn't wait for anyone to be ready. Damien took her hand. She didn't pull it back. They sat in the window of the building on Penn Avenue while the city went about its business below them, and neither of them said anything for a long time, because everything that needed saying had already been built, wall by wall, over 27 years, and a summer and a creek and a handful of clay passed between 2 damaged people who hadn't known, at the time, that they were laying a foundation. It held. It was still holding. And outside, the light moved across the floor of the room exactly the way she'd known it would, the way she'd seen it in her mind before the walls existed, before any of it existed, certain and unhurried, and entirely indifferent to whether anyone was ready for it, which is the only way light ever comes. Not to the people who are prepared for it, to the people who finally stopped looking away. There are 2 kinds of people in this world, those who build walls to keep things out, and those who build them to give something a place to live. The difference isn't in the hands, it's in what you believe about what's worth protecting. Some of us spend years convincing ourselves that nothing is. And then one ordinary night, in an ordinary diner, in the rain, someone hands us back a piece of ourselves we'd forgotten we'd left somewhere, and we have to decide, maybe for the first time, whether we're willing to pick it up. That decision is the story. Everything else is just what happens when you say yes.